Hello, it's 5 o'clock. It must be time for some more Falconer's Quarry. I'm back in my study, as you can probably tell from the picture on the wall, which you can see up there, made for me by my friend Helen Rolfe, who's also been a very good friend to me with this series because she has encouraged various other children to read it, and I know that I have readers and watchers who got into it because she suggested it, so that's really lovely. It's a lovely, lovely picture. In fact, I might just give you a close-up of it. Hang on a minute, because it's just so... It's a dot mandala. She painted every single dot herself. If you want to know where to get one, I can message me on the bottom of the post and I'll send you a link. It's the first... It's the first piece of art I have ever commissioned, and when I am allowed to use my study, which of course in the normal run of things I'd be in here a lot, I look at it every day and love it every day. Anyway, it's slightly haphazard today because whilst I'm back in the study, because my husband's away, yay to the study, not so yay to my husband and being away, I haven't got I usually balance the phone on my laptop because it gets it at quite a good angle. Today it's one of those laminating machines and a very large sausage of blue tack on account of the fact that one of my children is just currently doing something I'd never even thought about. He's doing a zoom sectional on his cello on my laptop in the sitting room. So there's a very famous violinist called Nicola Benedetti. She's young, she's Scottish, she's very beautiful. She won Young Musician when she was a teenager, probably about 10 years ago or something, I'm not sure. She's got her own foundation, and now while everybody's been stuck indoors, just this month, she's got this sort of lockdown orchestra thing going with a performance and all this sort of thing at the end of the month. And they're having sectionals, which is when you get all the people who are playing the same instrumental part together. And there are 173 cellists on this sectional. So Christopher's sitting in there playing the Paganini that you might know. It's the one that goes da 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 da. That one. He's playing the cello part, obviously, with 172 other cellists. And he's terrified. He's going, oh, I can't believe it's actually on mute. Is it really on mute? Can they really not hear me? And there's a teacher on the screen who's quite a funny man called David Munn. He's really quite funny. And so, yes, Christopher's been doing that on the screen. It's a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a stretch. His teacher suggested he go for the intermediate orchestra. And he should theoretically be good enough, but he's a bit frightened. Anyway, it's mostly a bit of fun, and today my older boys and I were watching this jazz pianist who's also part of the Benedetti Foundation talking about improvisation and showing you how to sort of sing along and pluck along and hum along with the bass line and the harmony in the middle and improvise on the melody of the same thing. And it was brilliant. It was brilliant. We were grooving in the kitchen and it was really good fun. So I would highly recommend those. They're on Facebook. You don't have to have signed up to be able to look at them, and his name is Richard Michael, I think. Anyway, Benedetti, the virtual Benedetti sessions. It's brilliant. And that was his improvisation workshop video from Monday on Facebook. Right, but actually that's not what you came for. Chapter 8. Oh yes, so Joe is home and of course he's had this whole mishap with the horse losing its tack, so its saddle and its bridle and everything coming unbuckled and coming off it as he appeared back in our world and as the horse appeared back in our world. And if you've ever stood around and waited while somebody tacks up a horse for you, you will know that actually it's quite a time-consuming business. Tack does not fall off a horse by mistake. But that is what's happened, and now the local newspaper, which happens to be my local newspaper because this place is near where I live, has got wind of it and has sent a reporter round to find out. So at the cottage where Joe and his dad and his brother are staying, somebody's knocked at the front door Lawrence Green. The man said, I'm a reporter with the Salisbury Journal. Can you tell me, did you go out riding this morning? Only I heard a rumour that something rather weird happened. Chapter 8. Joe stood mutely on the doormat. Don't worry, you're not in any trouble, said the man. I just thought you might be able to fill me in on the details. Joe said nothing. You fell off the horse, didn't you? Dad prompted. Can you tell Mr. Green about it? Joe ground his heel against the doormat. He knew perfectly well that wasn't what the reporter was after. But there was nothing he could say that would satisfy him. A hornet crawled into the horse's ear while I was riding along, he said in a flat voice. It stung the horse bolted into the woods. I fell off. The reporter scribbled this down in his notebook. What happened next? The lady from the riding school came along and checked I was all right. Then she went and fetched the horse. And what kind of state was the horse in? The reporter raised his eyebrows expectantly. Joe swallowed. Perhaps he could pretend he didn't know what the man was getting at. It had calmed down a bit by then, he said. But something a bit odd had happened to it, isn't that true? I don't know. The man peered into Joe's face. Joe refused to catch his eye. One of the stable hands told me that the horse's saddle and bridle were on the ground, the man said. Can you tell me anything about that? No, I don't know how it happened. The back of Joe's neck prickled with sweat. His legs were beginning to tremble. He hoped the man wouldn't notice. Had you undone the straps? Was that it? You fancied a bit of bareback riding? No! The word came out almost as a shout. Joe took a deep breath. I only just managed to hang on when the horse galloped off. Then I hit a branch and fell. Dad's hand was on his shoulder, steady and warm. But a horse can't take its own tack off, can it? Persisted the reporter. I don't know. Really, I don't know how it happened. You'll have to ask the stables. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. Dad squeezed Joe's shoulder. That's enough now, Mr. Green. I'm afraid Joe can't help you any further. The reporter opened his mouth to ask another question, but Dad said again, Enough. Lawrence Green stepped back. Thanks for your time then, Joe. Thank you for letting me speak to your son, Mr. Hopkins. Would you mind if I take Joe's photo for the article? I'd really rather you didn't, Dad said. Goodbye. He shut the door quickly before the man could get his phone out. Joe found he was shaking all over. Are you okay? Dad bent down and hugged him. There's really nothing to worry about. These people can just be a bit over-keen if they think they're onto a story. Joe nodded. Dad followed him back into the kitchen. Sam mentioned something about the tack falling off. Sounds a bit odd. Joe shrugged. I don't understand either. He went back to his laptop. He didn't want Dad asking questions as well. He was surprised at how unnerved he was. It had always been reassuring, knowing that whatever happened in Lucy's world, there would be no particular consequences in his own time. But this time there had been. Dad glanced over Joe's shoulder at the laptop screen. Why are you looking up scarlet fever? Not feeling peaky, are you? I don't think you're suffering from that. Joe shook his head. I was looking up illness in Tudor times, he said, stretching the truth very slightly. Look, he switched to the website for Old Wardour Castle. This place isn't too far from here, is it? Can we go there tomorrow? He kept his tone carefully casual. Ah, yes, Dad smiled. I stumbled across Old Wardour when I was trying to decide where to book a holiday cottage. In fact, that was one of the reasons I chose here. It looks interesting, doesn't it? It seems like a lot of the original castle is still there, Joe said. That's what I was thinking. I was going to suggest it as my choice of outing once you two had had your pick. I think the weather forecast for tomorrow is okay. So if it's open, we'll go, shall we? As long as Sam doesn't have any objection. He won't, Joe said rather too quickly. Dad grinned. You know Sam. He's not a history fanatic like us. He might take some persuading. Too bad, Joe thought. There was no way he was going home from here without visiting Lucy's castle. As they drove through the winding lanes to Wardour the next morning, excitement bubbled in Joe's chest at the thought of seeing the castle again. He wasn't expecting to get back into Lucy's world. He'd never managed to return so soon after he'd left. And anyway, goodness me, there's elephants on the stairs above me. And anyway, it wasn't the place that did it, not after the first time. As long as he and Lucy were thinking about each other while she was holding the St. Christopher, he could be called back into her time from anywhere. "Are we nearly there?" grumbled Sam. "You said it wasn't far, but we're in the middle of nowhere." "The last signpost said 2 miles, Dad replied. "I'm sure that was about 2 miles ago, so it can't be much further." They were driving along a narrow road, with woods sloping upwards to their left. Joe's senses felt as though they were out on stalks. Was this the same woodland he'd ridden through? He couldn't work out where the riding stables were from here, but in any case the trees looked too slender to be hundreds of years old. On the other hand, this hill might well be the part of the one he and Lucy had ridden down together. They rounded a bend, and at last the castle came into view. They were coming at it from the side, rather than straight ahead as he'd first seen it with Lucy. But the ruins nonetheless towered out of the ground to an impressive height. Joe jumped out of the car the second it stopped. He was hopping from foot to foot outside the ticket office by the time Dad and Sam reached him. "There's no hurry," Dad said, with a smile. "We've got the rest of the day, you know." "Can I have the free audio guide?" Joe asked. "If you like." "You're such a nerd," Sam said. Joe glared. "I'm not. I just like to know things." "Enough now, boys. Joe, you go on in, since you're so desperate. I'll pay for us, and Sam and I will catch you up in a minute." Joe didn't need to be told twice. He hurried off across the grass towards the castle, keen to have a quick look on his own before the others joined him. For a few moments he stood in the middle of what had previously been the busy compound. This was a really odd experience, he thought. Here he was, in a place he'd never visited before, and yet he felt as though he knew it. The castle was still so recognisable. For a ruin, in fact, it was magnificent, but at the same time it was also so different. The wall around the compound seemed mostly to have gone, taking the gatehouse, the stables, and all of the other outer buildings with it. He thought the ground level seemed higher than it had been in Lucy's time, and there was no track leading up to the entrance. On the other hand, there were several gigantic cedar trees which hadn't been there before. The castle itself was the greyish-golden colour of its natural stone rather than white. No pennants fluttered from the... Sorry, I think the connection just dropped out then. That's quite unusual. I'll just backtrack half a sentence. The castle itself was the greyish-golden colour of its natural stone rather than white. No pennants fluttered from the crumbling remains of the turrets, and the windows looked blindly out, unshuttered and empty of glass. He frowned. The remains of the 2 tall windows above the entrance must be in the great hall, but he didn't remember there being so many small windows in the towers to either side. He hurried up some steps and through an entrance flanked by pillars. The steps and the pillars were new too, except that they weren't new. In fact, they looked several hundred years old. They were just new since Lucy lived here. Joe registered a faint feeling of disapproval. The castle had been perfect just the way it was. Why had someone decided to make changes? Inside, the differences were much more to do with collapse and ruin. Morley's room was still there on the right, but the left-hand passage wall was gone, so that Joe now stood in a large, open space. Just like outside, the walls were no longer whitewashed, and the beautiful painted stonework, which had supported the ceiling, was now grey and mostly swallowed into the new floor of upstairs. "This place is fantastic." Sam was just behind him. I can't believe it isn't way more famous. It's a bit off the beaten track, I suppose, Dad said. I wonder what's up there. Sam hopped over the remains of the passageway wall into what had once been a storage room and disappeared up a spiral staircase. Joe walked towards the courtyard with Dad beside him. He was bracing himself for what he'd already seen from outside. The whole of the back of the castle was missing. Lucy's room, her parents' rooms, the suites of rooms above and below, even the room where the lady's maid had been cleaning the furs, they were all gone. The courtyard wall on that side was mostly gone too, except for the ground floor, where the windows and doorways looked out into thin air. The courtyard itself was bright and sunny, wide open to the sky. Joe wanted to cry. In Lucy's time it had been gloomy, overshadowed by the high walls, but it was heartbreaking to see it ruined like this. Look up there. Dad pointed at the ceiling of the passage. Those grooves are where a portcullis used to be. Looks like they had two, the one at the entrance and a second one here. I love it when there's so much left to help you imagine the place. Joe glanced up. I know, he wanted to say, but look what's been destroyed. Hey, what's the matter? Dad was looking at his face. Has something upset you? Joe turned away. He should have been prepared for this. He'd seen... Sorry, there's shrieking outside the room. This is what happens when I come down from the room upstairs, isn't it? It's always the way when I try and escape from the little attic room. Traffic too. I'm sure I hear that motorbike every single day. I'm sure it's somebody on their way home from work because it's always bombing past while I'm doing this. Anyway, sorry. Hey, what's the matter? Dad was looking at his face. Has something upset you? Joe turned away. He should have been prepared for this. Hold on a minute. Benji. Shh. You're really loud. Please be quieter. Honestly, he has no belief in art. Would I suffer? And all that sort of thing. Where was I? Joe turned away. He should have been prepared for this. He'd seen photos of the castle on the internet last night. But somehow it was different actually being here. I'd have thought this would be right up your street, Dad said, perplexed. It's rare to be able to get such a good sense of what life might have been like. Though you do realise it's not a Tudor building, don't you? I know that's your current passion. It's not, Joe said miserably. Look at the pointed arches over the doors and windows. They're a dead giveaway that it's earlier, probably late medieval. Shall we see what the audio guide says? Joe nodded. He didn't really care. The point was that Lucy had been here in the castle's heyday, and that was how he had seen it first. It had been so beautiful and so gloriously alive. Now, standing among the ruins, he felt overwhelmed by loss. What remained was certainly remarkable, and beautiful too, in its way. But it was like the ghost of the castle it had once been. Dad pressed the buttons on the audio guide. A voice began to explain that the castle had been built in the 1390s. There you are, interrupted Dad, nearly 100 years before Henry VII. It described what the courtyard had been like and what the rooms around it had been used for. Joe barely listened as they wandered round together. The only ground floor room he'd been into was the one with the stinking latrine. Most of the walls of that room were now gone, and it was open to the elements. Try as he might, he couldn't imagine himself talking to Lucy in there. He followed Dad over to the staircase leading up to the great hall. The audio guide was pointing out the round archway over this entrance and the changes to the steps made by a later owner called Matthew Arundel. So that was who had come along and decided to change bits of the castle. Joe felt a wave of resentment towards him. What had Lucy thought, he wondered. Then he realised that by the 1570s she might not have been here anymore. In fact, she would have been in her 40s, probably a mother of lots of children if she'd lived that long. His mind shied away from the idea. He didn't want to imagine that. It was too weird. At the top of the stairs they emerged directly into the great hall, where before there had been a dim passageway. Joe narrowed his eyes and tried to project what he'd seen onto what was left. But where the servants had taken their places at the trestle table beneath the vaulted ceiling, the sun shone down from a broad blue sky. The windows gaped like eye sockets in a skull, and the walls they were in teetered pointlessly with no roof to support. Even less was left of the room where he'd eaten lunch with Lucy and her aunt. He trailed after Dad back to the servery and buttery and up the spiral staircase to the lodgings that remained on the second and third floors. It was daft to feel so sad about it. If he'd come here first, before he slipped into Lucy's time, he would have been delighted by how much of the castle was left. They found Sam in one of the upstairs rooms. "This is great," he said. "There are staircases all over the place. Did you notice there's one room where you can come up one flight and go down another? Everywhere seems to lead to everywhere else. I'm hungry though. Can we have lunch soon?" "We can if you come back to the car with me to get the picnic stuff," Dad said. "Do you mind if I just have a quick look again at a couple of the rooms?" Joe asked. "That's not fair," Sam said, "just because you don't want to help fetch everything." "It isn't that, I promise. I'll take it all back after we've eaten." "All right," Dad said. "There are some steps across the grass over there in front of that grotto thing. We'll set up camp there. Don't be too long or we'll have eaten your sandwiches." He went off down the stairs with Sam. Joe waited until he couldn't hear them any more and then followed them down. He wasn't exactly sure which rooms he wanted to go back to. He just had a sudden desire to be on his own. He wandered back through the great hall to the far end, where Lucy had said the family sat up on the dais. If time passed at the same speed in her world as it did in his own, she would be sitting here right now. He closed his eyes. He could almost see her, delighted to be eating meat again for the Easter Day feast. There was a hissing sound in the air. He looked up, expecting to see a flock of birds overhead. But there was nothing but blue sky above him. He swayed slightly. All of a sudden, the sky was crisscrossed with branches. How had that happened? He hadn't closed his eyes except to blink. He felt giddy and put out a hand to steady himself. His fingers touched something rough. It was the bark of a tree. He tried not to think about anything for a few seconds while he waited for the dizziness to pass. It had been so abrupt this time, as though he'd been yanked out of his world on a rope. He tried to remember how it had been before. It was always a surprise, but there was usually a moment at least while the hissing grew louder. This time there had been no warning at all. Time had simply swung round. He rubbed his forehead. Sure enough, the cap was on his head again. He looked down at himself to check his clothes. They appeared to be exactly the same ones as before. He whistled beneath his breath and glanced around. He was standing in the forest, at the place where the track forked. How ridiculous. In his own time, he'd been right in the heart of the castle, quite possibly in the same room as Lucy. But the time slip had, as usual, put him back on the spot he'd disappeared from, 2 or 3 miles from Wardour. Hurriedly, he looked around in case no time had passed here. It was impossible to know. It might only have been a few minutes, or it might equally have been a year. Fortunately, the servant boy was nowhere to be seen. There was no sign of Joe's horse either, however. Of course, the animal would be in the stables back at home, having already caused enough trouble. He sighed. There was nothing for it. He would have to make his way down to the castle on foot. As he set off, he wondered how he was going to explain himself. There was a lot to account for this time. Where he'd been, why he hadn't delivered the message from Lucy's father to Sir William Paulet, how he'd come to be so far from Nunney without a horse. His chest tightened. What on earth was he going to say? So it's going to tax his ingenuity this time, it really is, to come up with a good excuse. But he will. He'll come up with a brilliant one, or at least a brilliant excuse will be thought of. So that's it for today. We're nearly halfway. What is it? Thursday. So we've got one more chapter this week. So we'll have chapter 9. And we'll see what happens next. What excuse does he come up with? And more importantly, what impact does that have on the people around him? Ha! You'll have to come back tomorrow and see. Right, that's it. I need to go and, we had fish fingers last night. It's beans on toast tonight. It's all just high living in this house. Oh, yes. Yes. I hope you have something more inspired than baked beans on toast for your dinner tonight. But I will see you tomorrow, I hope.